So in this video we're going to do three things: explore some practical ways of acting in a discerning way rather than a condemning way. The second thing is to reflect on the relationship between the gate and the way in Matthew 7. And thirdly, to think about why Jesus likens himself to a narrow gate. So firstly, some practical ways of acting in a discerning way rather than a condemning way. And for this I've done a bit of a meditation on Philippians chapter 2 verse 3. If you want to look at that, I actually preached a sermon on it some time ago. It'll be in the sermon files on the website for All Saints Network if you want to have a look at it. But in Philippians 2 verse 3, which talks about in humility consider others better than yourselves. I don't know about you, but I've noticed that when someone is late to an appointment, or perish the thought, they're late to church, all sorts of thoughts float through my mind, like they're so slack, why don't they get up earlier or something? Mind you, when I'm running late, it's usually because I've done something, and because of something that's gone wrong, not because of something I've done. My intentions were beyond reproach. It was something that somebody else did or they didn't do. And I suspect that something similar happens to you, because I think this is an almost universal tendency to judge ourselves by our motives and others by their actions. It's destructive, I think, of community and the like-mindedness that Paul calls us to in Philippians 2. And I think it's behind the reasons why we become condemning. So, as a way forward, how can we live out this verse? Well, firstly, by not comparing yourselves with others. And I know that's not easy because that's quite a normal thing for us to do. So, not compare yourself with others. Secondly, know yourself. Know that you're a special creation of Jesus with your own unique gifts, your strengths, weaknesses, your own calling, your own special, unique relationship with Jesus. Thirdly, don't excuse your shortcomings or pretend that you don't have them, but face your imperfections honestly and gently. So that's some stuff to do for yourself. Then when you get offended by what someone else says, gently ask them how they came to have that opinion rather than telling them off or telling them what you think. And if you're confronted by someone else's behaviour, which you might lead to condemning them, let's try and wonder what the intention behind the behaviour might be, what their motive might have been, and to think the best of them. This is one way we can consider others better than themselves, think the best of another person. Paul talks about selfish ambition and vain conceit, which leads us to believe that we're better than everybody else. Selfish ambition, the Greek word, has a sense of engaging in political intrigue to achieve position. And vain conceit is probably better translated as groundless pride. Both of those things lead us to condemn others. And then if you need to talk to a person whose behaviour or words bug you, try and remember that all behaviour is caused by something. And the question you might like to ask of the person you're talking to is, what were you hoping to achieve by that action or by those words? And see if you can really see things from their perspective before you give them some feedback about what the result of that behaviour was. You might say, well, I was really trying to be helpful. Well, let me tell you, I didn't find it helpful. Not to say that you weren't trying to make it helpful, but for me, I didn't find it as helpful. And this kind of pattern, I have to tell you, is one that I've used in a number of different settings. As a teacher and a principal at schools with troubled and dysfunctional young people, when I worked as a youth and community worker, with my own kids, with my wife, with my family, my siblings. I confess the place where I find it hardest to do it is in meetings, because I get caught up with the adrenaline of it all, particularly church meetings. But I'm working on making this an attitude to be expressed in more and more of my life. So there's a few clues about how we can, some practical steps about moving away from condemning someone to more like a discernment kind of process. Okay? The second thing that I want us to look at is the relationship between the gate and the way. In the first reading of those verses in Matthew 7, it looks as if there are two gates and two roads which lead to two very different destinies. The problem with seeing it like that is that if the road to life is a metaphor for eternal life, which I think it is, well, the life of Christ that's risen, the risen Christ within us, isn't, in my experience, narrow and confining, but it's rich and deep and wide and expansive. And the teachings of the Old Testament seem to indicate the same thing. The Hebrew word that we would translate as salvation in the Old Testament, remember, Jesus used the Old Testament as a frame of reference during his earthly ministry, both because his listeners were familiar with it and he was familiar with it. But the word for salvation in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word, comes from a root word which means to be wide, to be spacious, or to develop without hindrance. In Psalm 31 verse 8 and Psalm 18 verse 19, I don't know if you know those psalms, they're two wonderful psalms about redemption. But in those verses, God has brought, or he's set the feet of those he rescues and redeems in a spacious place, or to a spacious place. So life with God is meant to be spacious and expanding and growing. And I guess you, as I certainly do, and I guess you do too, from observation and experience, how constricting and narrowing selfishness, sinful selfishness is. So what's this stuff about it being a narrow gate? Well, a little bit more about that in the next section of this video. Now, they tell me in Greek, I'm not as familiar with Greek as I am with Hebrew, but they tell me that in Greek the word order is notoriously flexible. And so it's encouraging to me to read a conservative evangelical scholar like Tasker in the Tyndale New Testament commentary, compare the verses in Matthew 7 with the verses in Matthew 13:23, and conclude that despite the order in which the way and the gate are mentioned, the two ways lead up to two gates, rather than two gates opening onto two ways. So it's a narrow way and a narrow gate that leads to life, if that makes sense. It's not a narrow gate that leads to a way which is narrow, but a narrow way and a narrow gate which leads to life. Okay, the third part in this video is to think about why Jesus likens himself to a narrow gate. If you remember, I've talked about in the sermon, Jesus described himself as the gate, Jesus describes himself as the way, Jesus describes himself as life. So if Jesus is the gate, why would you describe Jesus and his way of life and his teaching as narrow or small, which is another way of looking at that verse in the Greek? For certainly the implications of Jesus' life and our allegiance to him, and certainly the results that come from our placing our allegiance to him, neither of those things could be described as small or narrow. Putting Jesus' words into action, or doing God's will, Jesus' will, leads to huge changes and to an existence that's larger than life. So it seems to me, from the text, it's the way into that free and full life, free and full way of life with Jesus, that's small and narrow. What's that way in? Well, in my sermon I talk about taking on the life of Jesus as our own. And in the sermon you'll see I came to that conclusion by looking at the statements that Jesus made in John's Gospel about being the gate and the way and the life. However, just by looking at the text in Matthew, I think we can come to the same conclusion in a bit of a roundabout way. If you look at the text, immediately before inviting us to enter via the narrow gate, Jesus has expounded what our culture calls the golden rule. In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. That's a pretty specific, a pretty narrow and a pretty terse explanation of what the Torah and the prophets teach. Remember, that's verse 14. This is the whole of the Torah and prophets. The implications of that teaching In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you, of course, are far-reaching. By contrast, the audience to whom that Jesus was speaking were familiar with the Torah and the teachers of the Torah. And the teachers of the Torah, especially the Pharisees, were well on the way to the position that they achieved by the medieval times of broadening the ethical demands of Torah into 613 commandments. James talked about that a little bit in the sermon last week. 365 things that you're not supposed to do, and 248 things that you're supposed to do. In my view, that's a kind of a scattergun approach. And the Jewish version of the Golden Rule was, whatever you would not wish done to you, do not do yourself to another. You get it? It's a negative thing. It's much broader, much less onerous. What you wouldn't want someone to do you, don't do that to others. For it seems to me, as I reflect on my own behaviour and on the behaviour of people around me, that we kind of slide towards a list of things to do and not to do. And then we try and get as close to the light as we can, obeying the letter of the law rather than its spirit. I think you know the sort of thing I'm talking about. We get as close as we can to the speed limit, or just slightly over, officer, or we put limits on our generosity. Well, we've done more than most other people, Lord, how can you condemn us? But these words of Jesus cut through the fog of all our attempted justifications. These simple and profound words. Jesus says, in everything, not just some things, but in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. The preceding 91 verses of the Sermon on the Mount that we've had a look at over the course of the years have stressed that it's not the outward actions of religious observance that we need to focus on. Rather, it's the inward attitudes and motives that we've grown so skilled in cloaking that we need to give attention to. If we simply pay sufficient attention to, if we simply narrow our focus onto the sources of our behaviour, then it's less likely, I think, that we'll get lost in spiritual point scoring, self-righteousness, self-justification, trying to justify ourselves by what we do or don't do. For in the context of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, I want to suggest that the attitude that Jesus calls us to, the way that leads to life that Jesus is can be described this way. It's not just about outward show, but it's also about private thoughts and actions. It's about a narrow focus on a radical trust in Jesus rather than trusting in objects that we can accumulate or trusting in reputations that we try to cultivate and enhance. In the words of the Beatitudes, it's about being poor in spirit, gentle and humble, kind and merciful, single-hearted, hungry and for righteousness. It's about being a bringer of peace and wholeness. It's about both mourning our lack of those characteristics when we don't have them, and also suffering persecution when we do embrace and practice them. So carefully fixing our attention on these inner attributes, inner orientations, inner attitudes, if you like, will open for us a wide and spacious freedom in which we can find our place in loving service of our loving God. But if you're like me, that's a lot of stuff to focus on. Maybe it's too much. Maybe it's much easier to remember to keep at the forefront of my awareness, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. Not just in my actions, but in my thoughts and attitudes, my emotional responses to others as well. So whatever you want others to think about you, think about them. However you want people to respond to you, respond to them. If you don't want people to condemn you, don't condemn them. Now, even a nice simple thing of saying, yep, in everything do to others as you would have them do to you, as I suggested in the sermon, is something we can't do by ourselves. We need God's transformation, God's ongoing help, his ongoing transformation of our lives. In the words that I quoted from that lovely quote from C.S. Lewis, we just don't need having the grass cut. We need to be ploughed up and resown. And may God find us willing to allow him to do that work in us. God bless you. Thanks.